Hi, and welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. Today I'm joined by Dr. Bruce Kirchoff, who teaches science communication and is also a botanist who teaches botany and science communication at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Today we're here talking about science communication and what a ideal science communication curriculum would look like. And actually, sort of in preparation for this discussion, I read a Research America report that's authored by Fenwel Mwindi and others, and who is a fellow at Research America, and he actually surveyed all of the different science communication courses that are happening in the U.S. and sort of like looked at them, talked to people, including me actually. I don't know if Fenwel reached out to you, but different things about what aspects of science communication are like what are people doing about science communication. And actually those research found that there are a lot of training programs. There's just a lot of really small training programs. So I think it would be my personal idea, and I don't know if this is possible, is to have science communication be like a federal requirement in training grants or something, or like having a federal science communications requirement as part of scientific training. And so um, that's why Dr. Kirchhoff has been on this Fancy Comedy YouTube before talking about his book Presenting Science Concisely and his experiences teaching science communication to botanists. I'll link that video in the description box. But we're just going to, for this, have a chat about what that would look like to have like a SciComm mandated part of science communication in the training programs. So, Dr. Kirchhoff, my first question for you is what have how have you been able to incorporate science communication training into your science courses uh, as part of the scientific training, and what does that involve and what does that look like?
That's a bit of a hard question for me to answer because I didn't teach scientific communication as a standalone course, and I taught mostly undergraduate courses where there was a definite content that wasn't communication. However, wasn't scientific communication. However, I taught those courses as what we called speaking intensive. So they're starting in the 90s across the United States. There was a movement called speaking across the curriculum. And there was also a writing across the curriculum program. And the idea was to infuse these humanities skills, speaking and writing, not just in courses in English or in certain disciplinary courses where you would expect the students to be writing, but in all courses across all disciplines. And so at my university, we implemented these programs starting in the early 90s, and they've kind of phased out now because things just go in phases for no particular reason. People decide that it doesn't work anymore, even though it works fine. One of those crazy things about life. Stick around long enough and it all changes for no apparent reason. So anyway, they've kind of phased them out in a certain way at my university. But for quite a few years there, we had this speaking across the curriculum program. And all of my courses were speaking, what we called speaking intensive. So we had students in science courses talking about science. And I was very fortunate to have small classes, relatively small classes. So my classes range from 24 up to about 72. And I found ways to get students presenting in those classes and learning to present scientific information to their classmates, which meant to people who didn't really understand anything about the field that they were just learning about because these areas were all new to them. And they were relatively high level courses that these weren't intermediate these weren't beginning courses in biology. They were tend to be courses that were taken by seniors or maybe second semester juniors. So I had very many final semester seniors in my courses, so they were more mature students in these courses. How do we do that? So the real important thing, I think, in teaching people to communicate well is to get them to communicate, that is, to practice. So I look at communication as I look at any kind of skill, a skill like learning to play basketball. You don't learn to play basketball by going out and shooting one basket and giving up. You don't go to learn basketball by going to listen to a lecture on basketball. You go out day after day and you shoot baskets and you make a lot of mistakes and you do it again and again. And your coach says, try this, try that. And you do it again until you get a little bit better at it. I think communication works the same way. The best thing we can do is get students to practice. And so within the constraints of my course, I gave them as much practice as I could, which meant for many of my courses, I turned over the content to the students. I would do some lectures, but I would ask them to lecture. So of course we had to give them guidance in how to do that. I'll give you an example in the course where I did it the most, which was a course in evolution. So I had a relatively small class in evolution. So I had about 24 students in my evolution class. And so I looked at the textbooks that were available for evolution, and they were all, in my opinion, terrible. They were all pre-digested. That is, they didn't really explain why we knew things or how we knew things. They said, we know this stuff, and this is how it is, and this is all the evidence we have for this, and you should believe it. Of course, I'm teaching in the southeastern United States, and whether they admit it or not, good deal of my students, even as seniors, didn't believe it. And so I knew that was always there in the background. So just going to tell them they should believe in evolution because I say they should wasn't really a good starter. So what did we do? We looked at Darwin. Darwin was amazing. Darwin is just, I mean, I didn't like him when I started this process, but he's my hero now because he he walks you through his reasoning. He walks you through his process. And so we didn't just read Darwin's Origin of Species, first edition. I had the students present it. So the students selected chapters. There are mistakes in the origin that we don't want to perpetuate. So we skipped those chapters. But a lot of the things, first chapter, for instance, is wonderful about variation in domestication. Really great chapter. And so we divided up the chapters. Students had to present it. They had to get up and they had to explain Darwin's ideas. They had to explain what he looked at. They had to use examples that he used. They could find pictures of the pigeons that he talked about. They could explain the variation in the pigeons and how he thought about it. So they had to work through his ideas and they had to present that. So they would do that, and then they would do 2 or 3 other assignments in the course of the semester that were similar, working with Darwin or other textbooks that were similar. There's not very many, but I was able to find another one that was also very good because it didn't just give you the facts, it worked you through how we know certain things about paleontology. This one was. And they did those things. They ended up writing a paper on a portion of their choice. They got feedback from the other students about how their paper was because they wouldn't take what I said. Sir, I have a lot of experience of writing long comments on student papers and having them be ignored. But if I sit 2 students down together with next to each other and they've read each other paper and one of the students says, well, I didn't understand this part of things, that first student takes it really seriously, I found. So they did that. They got feedback from me, and then they presented again. They presented, and this was what most of their grade was based on, their final presentation. So they had a whole semester of presenting content before they had to get up from in front of their audience of peers and present something about evolution that was of particular interest to them. And some of these students just really nailed it. I mean, we say, uh, don't put too many graphs on your slides. Try to keep the slides relatively simple. Don't have a lot of text on your slides. So I remember one of my minority students produced his slide set and I had them turn the slides first so I could look at them before I was going to grade them. And, I said, oh God, there's no text on these slides. I'm afraid he's going to mess this up, things. Oh my God, he nailed it. It was the perfect slide set. He got up in front of the audience. He was standing in front of the audience. The slides were in back of him. He didn't turn around and look at the slides. There's no text on the slides. Didn't tell him anything. He knew what he wanted to say. He knew what the slides were going to be there. And all the information flowed through him to the audience. And the other minority students in the class are going, wow, I want to be like that guy. It was wonderful. One of the greatest teaching moments of my career. And I just didn't do anything. I was just sitting there in the audience saying, yeah, you go, guy. That was a great presentation. But we only got there because they practiced. Practice, practice, feedback, practice, feedback, practice, feedback, practice, feedback, whole semester of that. So that's if you want to really change lives. And I know I changed that kid's life, and I know it's not the only one. I think that's what you have to do. So, you know, writing down all the things that you should know about science communication is a great, and the work that you've done on that is great. You really nice start, really good discussion starter. People should be thinking about all of the things you put in your description of what a course would be like. Those are really fantastic. And we need to add to that, make sure that when you're teaching it, the students are doing the work. You are the instructor. You're going to put things together so that your work is all in the background. It should look to the students like you're just sitting there in class. You're not doing anything. You're writing a few notes or things, because your work has been done all in the background and you're making them do the work out there. Once you can put what you've done together with this basic idea, you can bring about real change in people's learning, I think. Well, I know it because I've seen it happen.
Yeah, and you've been doing this for a very long time. I think I'm assuming way before science communication was even a thing, just to get people to communicate better. Because you said in our other interview that you would go to talks and people didn't understand. You couldn't understand what your colleagues were saying because I mean, on some level you can, but it takes a lot of like thinking. Like I've been there too, where you're like, what is this person saying? And I've noticed that there's a lot of professors that actually do focus a lot on writing and science communication, and their talks are much easier to understand than others. Like sometimes it's just PowerPoint after PowerPoint of data, and then you're like, especially if you're not in that exact field, you're like, what am I really looking at, or like what's really being said here? And it's like the cognitive processing involved to understand some presentations, I think is very that's a huge challenge, and I think that's like something that SciComm, as you mentioned, the practicing your SciComm skills is something that is really important. SciComm isn't part of the mainstream narrative of scientific training, and it's a huge effort to raise awareness of science communication because it's really important when you think of um, all of the things that science is involved in, government, our everyday lives. The COVID pandemic, that was huge for science and just for scientists to understand each other better because they do a lot of writing, a lot of presentations, and have no training in these presentations. So like one thing that I really struggled with in grad school was I would have to write a paper or do something, and I didn't have any way to structure my time because we never talked about like brainstorming the different steps of writing a paper. So I would get really stressed out, eat a lot of carbs, and then I would just like have this thing where I'd get really stressed out, and then I would just kind of like hit a low, and then I from there I could finally start thinking about my paper. But the stress that comes from not having any training, never getting concrete um, like guidance, which we did have like assignments like in grad school. I wrote, and I also repeated this when I worked in Congress. I wrote about a rare disease, and then in Congress, one day there was a rare disease being discussed, and so they asked me, "Can you please summarize this disease?" And I had no idea what it was. Because I was a scientist, I could just Google it and then understand what was going on with it, and then type up a memo for them. One thing that was mentioned in the Research America report that um, I guess is less relevant for science communication training programs because the goal is to get people to speak and write well, and if they can do that, they've kind of achieved their objective. But there's also like an assessment aspect of science programs, I guess, because I haven't done a lot of teaching like specifically in university with like assessments and stuff. I haven't done assessments because my goal was always if I can get my students to like understand this and like know about it, then I think I'm done. Do you do assessments in your scientific communications? Is your assessment part of the assignment, or do you find that do students say in their feedback, because there's always a feedback you give to your professor at the end of the semester, are they like grateful for this for science communication training, or do they do better in life, or like what are the outcomes that you've seen with science communication training?
Well, we don't have a way at the university for following up with the students after they graduate. I mean, not in no effective ways. There are sometimes some surveys that people do, but the professors never get involved in those things, and neither nor do I think they should be involved in the those kinds of long-term assessments. That's a research program that someone might take on. um, what we do for assessment is we give grades, and if we are effective in that and we know how to do it, we know how to use grades effectively, they have some meaning for the students, and we're not just giving all A's for showing up. uh, I'm not saying you have to be really hard. I'm saying you have to know what you're doing, and I'll give you an example here in a second of what I mean by that. But grades should be a means of assessment. They were always intended to be a means of assessment within the course, and they were supposed to be assessing whether the student had understood the material, whatever that means, understood the material. So in the course that I described a minute ago, the way that I used grades was and this also played to your idea of that the students are often very nervous about getting up in front of an audience or writing something, is that the first assignments had no grade to them. They only got feedback. So there was no grade at all associated with the first couple speaking assignments. And the grades gradually increased during the semester. And only at the very end, when they had to turn in the final paper after they've had a chance to rewrite it and all kinds of things, first, they had to really make sure that they were completely satisfied with it. They had every opportunity in the world to do that. Um, Only then were were the grades a significant part of what their semester grade was going to be. So I think that's a much better way of using grades. It's not certainly not the way that I started using grades. It's a much better way of using a grade where, every assignment has equal number of grades and you mess up your first assignment and it's going to follow you the whole semester. You It's like playing basketball. You go out there and you shoot a basket and you miss it, and that shouldn't determine your whole career. It should make no difference at all to your whole career. You should get that free. In fact, that whole first season probably is free. And with that kind of attitude and encouragement, I think we can do well. So that's the kind of assessment that I think can be most meaningful and meaningful for the students. I don't. There's a lot of other kinds of assessment that go on. I've seen a lot of it. I've worked on assessment committees. You know, I don't find that those things serve uh, almost anyone except the people doing the assessment. People have made their careers by saying, "You are not assessing these programs correctly. You should follow the my advice for this," and then they write papers on it and they get promoted and they things and they've made other things and it really helped their career. I haven't seen it really that kind of assessment really help universities that much. But they spend a lot of time and a lot of money on it.
It's really interesting because when I think of assessments, I think of real world skills that people can get from for science communication, being able to talk well, being able to write. For me, like we have our new science communication curriculum that I came up with just entirely based on the SciComm blog because I realized it could actually be used as educational resource. So we have like how to write a policy or not a policy memo, like an elevator pitch to your policymakers, which is outside of science, but it's a skill that transfers well. Um, and so I forgot where I was going with that, but I wanted to mention. I just thought, remember this. Brittany Trin is someone that follows Fancy Comma, and I follow her on Instagram. And she was writing a paper, and she also has a podcast. I'll link all of her stuff. But she was saying she had an Instagram story where she said, "I have to write this paper, but luckily, because I work on podcast production, it's a lot easier because now my paper is writing is easier because I guess once you engage that part of your mind where you're like thinking about like how am I going to say this? Like who's going to be listening to this? Like all of the steps involved in writing for an audience because you're always writing for an audience unless you even if that audience is just yourself like in your lab notebook, but I thought that was really neat and I think that gave me this idea that like and I think it's not possible to do this because many scientists grad students don't have time, but like communication related activities like working on a podcast or working on Capitol Hill, that's kind of impossible for anyone that doesn't live in Washington D.C. because that's pretty far from them, even pretty far from me at Georgetown. Um, it's nice to have these like transferable skills that you can get better in the communications realm. And I don't, but the hard part about that is that students have to seek those out, and it's much easier if there's just like a unified thing, like even if it's not like an exciting thing, like oh, I'm working on a podcast, like because that's really cool to work on a podcast. I think I'm currently working on a podcast actually about the neuroscience of journalism and trauma based on my science work that's studying PTSD. And so I think that if one thing is like if you can get the so one thing is that gaining the skill is the outcome that they have. There's if you can write effectively, then you don't need an assessment. Like your professor sees it, you go on to communicate better, and that has cascading effect. Like you get more eyes on your work, you can communicate better, you can communicate to different people. But I think it would be fun to have like an engaging training beyond like write this paper, fun ways to do science. Like now, when I was in graduate school, Instagram didn't exist because I think it got started in 2010 or so, and I left in 2013. But no one used Instagram back then. But now I see a lot of scientists that are on social media, and they like they do like reels about their science, and I think that's a form of science communication, even if because it's explaining your science to someone. And that's why one of our assignments that I have on the fancy comma science curriculum is like create a TikTok, or well, I can't use TikTok because for various reasons, but like creating a TikTok, Instagram reel of your work is like really, it's fast. It just requires explaining your work to like anyone, not like scientists. There's no stress involved because everyone's on social media these days. Stuff like that, I think, can make science communication really exciting.
Practice. Find excuses or ways to practice. And whether those, if those are social media, that's fine. If you're giving a report to your lab group, you're in a graduate school and you're starting your research and you have to present a paper to the lab group, work on that presentation so you do it a little bit better next time. Think about how you would make that better. Look for examples out there of people who present well and try to copy them. Now, actually, this is a real big problem because there aren't good examples that I can find out there of how people present well. There are things, you have things like TED Talks, but those are not transferable. That's something really a different thing. A TED Talk is its own highly practiced, unique ecosystem. So what we really need is we need examples on social media, on YouTube or places where people can go and watch relatively short talks. By I mean short talks, maybe 10 minutes, of someone talking about their research to another scientist and presenting well. And those are almost impossible to find. The closest thing you can get are the Asia Pacific 3-minute thesis winners are put on Vimeo, I think it is. And you can find those, and they're excellent. They're a little bit more to a general audience than if you were explaining something to another scientist, but that's the closest I know that you can get. What we really need are people to go around and take videos of people doing presentations at scientific meetings and put them outside of a paywall. They're out there, but they're all behind paywalls. So you can't go and look at them. You can't show them to someone. You have to pay for them, and then you have to get permission from the person if you're going to download it and put it someplace else. That's a big problem. We need to solve that problem somehow. And so that people can look at examples. I mean, imagine that you tried to learn to play basketball and you never saw anyone playing basketball. I mean, how hard would that be? You couldn't do it. So it's not really surprising that we're having a hard time teaching people to present well. They never see great examples. The only place they see examples are at scientific meetings, and they're not really focused on how they're presenting there. They're focused on the content, and some of the presentations aren't so good anyway. They're really mixed in. So we need this. We need this really badly.
Yeah, I agree, and I really like the basketball analogy because it really makes sense. Like if you don't have this skill set, if because a lot of scientists, and I know a lot of people from MIT that really just didn't like writing. Like they loved reading science fiction, but then when it came to writing about science and engineering, they just didn't like it. Like they would just say that they didn't like writing, and so there's kind of like, I mean, that's in engineering. I don't know. It's kind of the same for science, but science has so much more. I feel like in engineering, people don't write as much as they just like provide lists of things that they have done. But I was actually chemical engineer for a very short time, and well, for 2 years in college actually, and I don't remember writing any papers in chemical engineering, like lab reports maybe, but the basketball analogy is really good because it's if you don't know how to play basketball, like how are you going to play basketball? Like you can watch other people play basketball and try to learn from them. You have to also have experience playing basketball. I'm a lifelong NBA fan, and now that Oklahoma has the Thunder, I'm a Thunder fan. Um, and I watched I think it was 1996 NBA Finals with Michael Jordan, and I mean, basically, I think everyone at young people at that time all wanted to be like Michael Jordan and excel at that level. And it comes from, and all of his famous inspirational quotes are like, if you don't take risks, you'll never succeed, and like all of this stuff about like putting yourself out there every day and making the effort. And I also do a lot of English tutoring. I'm an online tutor, and a lot of times students have this like mental block about writing. They're like, oh, I really want to do this assignment, but I don't know what I want to say. And it's just as simple as telling them like, just come up with something. It doesn't have to be like perfect. Just make it your best effort, and then we'll go from there and see how we can improve your writing. And actually, sometimes the students really shock me and they come up with like some really great writing at like a sentence or something. I'm like, wow, I didn't know that person had it in them. So I think it's, and a lot of times in science, I'm currently tutoring a science writing student, and she works in a lab, and she had a mental block about writing because she's afraid of her advisor, like basically shooting down her ideas. So that's another thing. So there's like all the, if you don't practice writing, then then you can't figure out creative ways to like get past these mental blocks, because it can be very stressful to think about what you want to say, how you're going to say it. Is it going to be good? Like in science, the challenge I've learned is synthesizing many different information pieces of information and making them all form a coherent narrative. Like that's the hardest part of science writing to me, that you
Mm-hmm.
don't really have that. And but it's that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing as scientists, is break new ground continually, innovate, and practice, as you said, is what gets you to become a polished communicator. Because I've noticed your communication style, I think, because you've been communicating and training people in communication and talking about communication, is very like professional. You don't say and a lot. You know, I feel like you always know what you're going to say, and you just communicate it very clearly. And I think that honestly, a lot of scientists, they really struggle with that. And I guess that you're right. That it must be that practicing SciComm skills, having opportunities to get those, to be able to practice them, even if it's like not super structured. The Research America report surveyed a bunch of different programs. There's actually science communication courses happening. I forget what universities they were, but there was one. There were two state schools, I think, that teach like Iowa something. Iowa has a very good writing program, so I'm not surprised that they have a science communication program. But but it doesn't have to be that structured to get the benefit of communication skills.
I always try to speak to young scientists, and I say that it's very important for young scientists to learn to communicate well for their careers. We often talk about scientific communication as if we're communicating with the general public, but scientists have to communicate with people outside of their narrow specialty, outside of their small research area. And this is really important for a lot of reasons. One reason is because 90% of the jobs out there 99% of the jobs out there are going to be in situations where you have to communicate with someone who doesn't work in the same area as you, which means you have to be able to explain your research to someone who is outside your immediate area. So learning to communicate well can have a really big effect on your career. If you go to give a job seminar and they can't understand what you're saying, you're not going to get the job. You know, if it's all jargon and it seems like you really know your stuff, but no one here understands you, you know, that's not a good not good for you. And the other reason is get writing grants. You know, writing grants, you're going to have to communicate with people outside your field. Very rarely are you going to get someone in your little niche area who's reviewing your grant. You've got to convince someone who isn't in your niche area that what you want to do is important. And so you need good communication skills for that. So for young scientists, especially, I really emphasize just find examples, find ways to practice. You can look for short courses. Ecological Society now is offering at least every year and maybe more often courses in communication that help you write better titles, help you write better abstracts, help you give better talks. I just offered a course for the Ecological Society of America yesterday on writing a good title, which is really about understanding your research. It's not just about a title, it's about really understanding your research at depth. So, you know, look for those opportunities as young scientists, and your work will get better and it'll make a big difference to your career.
Do you think that science communication will become an established part of federal training programs? The White House, which has no control over science funding and the way that's appropriated, has issued a memo, and I haven't read it honestly. It's about science communication. Its use in, I think, in the federal government, but the NIH and SF are in the federal government, so I don't know to what extent it applies to academia. But do you think that there's momentum for a science communication, like federally mandated science communication, just from your personal experience, back to bring back the communicating across the 1990s SciComm type thing that wasn't really called SciComm back then?
I hope there is. I mean, I know that there have been discussions at NIH for NIH grants. For some of the training grants, I know there were high level discussions about including scientific communication as part of the requirements. I don't know where those went. I'm not sure if they went anywhere, but I know that they were starting to take place, and I knew someone who was really pushing, a former NIH officer, has now retired, but was really pushing NIH toward in this region, also adding his voice to this. So I'm hopeful that. I don't know what's going on with National Science Foundation. I imagine there have been some talks about it. I know that there are a lot of grant opportunities at the National Science Foundation that can be leveraged around scientific communication. But I don't know of any specific programs that require it. And you'd want to see it in the training programs at NSF. I'm hopeful. I don't I don't know if it's going to happen or not.
There's all these little science communication programs that have popped up, like you can get free training, you can pay to get training. I feel like, to me, that's like a sign for like a need in science itself, but will professors structure their courses, like will they see the need to do that? I wonder, even more than like beyond just like writing, will they have time? A lot of times people don't have time for this. How have you made time to teach science communication as part of your science courses, or do you feel that it detracts, or do you just incorporate it into your curriculum just regularly?
Well, so I'm retired now, and so I teach scientific communication kind of on the side now, and I try to get scientific societies to offer courses that I teach, and I don't charge for those. Um, So I offer my services to the societies, and I try to do that. When I was teaching courses, as I say, I didn't specifically call it scientific communication. It fit into the, you have to fit these things into what your institution recognizes as a valid thing for a faculty member to do. And what was recognized at that time and what was a requirement for students was this thing called communication across the curriculum. Communication. Now, we were doing communication in science courses, so we were doing science communication, but we never called it that. We just said this is a course where you're going to learn to speak well.
It was a separate course from your science courses, but you were speaking about science, I
No,
assume.
it was a science course. It was a regular science course. Regular.
Oh,
I just taught it
all
as
right.
I taught it as with a very big communications component to it. Not all faculty did that, but that's how I did it. I fitted into this communication across the curriculum program, which gave me a little checkbox on my annual reports, and it drew students to the course because they had to satisfy a competency in communication that was in their discipline. And since they were science students, they had to satisfy a communication competency in the sciences. And so I was one of the faculty, one of the few faculty, in fact, who allowed them to do that in my courses.
That's cool. Actually, MIT's communication requirement was kind of like that. It required you to take some courses in your major that were had a very focus on communication, either written or oral, and then also you had to take some humanities courses because it's MIT, and like we actually did have humanities there, and I minored in Spanish literature, I think. So I could talk about this topic all day, and I'm sure you could too. But I think that we have talked about some really I'm really excited about the idea of having more science communication in courses, and people can kind of look to your experience in science communication as a model, and realize that science communication is kind of a part of science, and when it's taught as a part of science, people are just better communicators, and that's what I think we're both doing a lot of. You way more than me because you're kind of my role model in science communication because you're also a scientist, and I'm just kind of I'm the science communication enthusiast.
Yeah, we need you.
Anyway, thanks. Yeah, I we it's bizarre, but I'm one of the few people. My clients tell me that it's rare for them to see someone with so much communications experience in science, and so that's why they hire me. And so now I feel like that's kind of I was very flattered by that compliment, but I was also very saddened that no scientists are communicating on this level as me or something. At least my client was really nice. They were trying to flatter me. So, but I really appreciate your time and your insight, and I think that our viewers will find it really valuable. And um, I look forward to being part of this science training discussion with you and all the other people out there doing this work. So, thank you for your time today, and thanks for being on our YouTube.
Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to talk to you again.